The dust knew her shame. It clung to her skin like a second, grittier layer of self, caking in the creases of her eyelids and the cracked hollows of her lips. She stood tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square, a patch of ground beaten hard and pale by sun and indifference. Her feet, bare and bruised, were numb to the heat of the earth. A crude sign hung from a rope around her neck, its single word gouged into the wood, thief. The letters were a brand burned not on her flesh, but on the air she was forced to breathe. She kept her gaze fixed on a point just beyond her own toes, on a small, smooth stone embedded in the dirt. It was a world unto itself, a planet of gray in a universe of brown. If she focused on the stone, she did not have to see the boots that shuffled past, or the hems of dresses that swished with sanctimonious whispers. She did not have to see the faces. The faces were the worst part. A glob of spit landed near her left foot, dark and wet against the pale dust. It was followed by a ripple of low laughter from a knot of men lounging in the sliver of shade offered by the general store's overhang. Their amusement was a physical thing, a wave of heat that washed over her and left her colder than before. She did not flinch. Her stillness was the only armor she had left, a thin, brittle shield against the world. She had made herself small inside her own body, a kernel of being tucked away in a place they could not reach. The sun climbed higher, a merciless eye in a bleached white sky. The town went about its business. Wagons creaked, a blacksmith's hammer fell in a distant, rhythmic clang, and women called to their children in voices sharp as splintered wood. She was a piece of the landscape now, a temporary monument to civic justice, and like all monuments, she was quickly becoming invisible to those who saw her every day. The initial curiosity had curdled into casual contempt, and then, finally, into the blankness of routine. She was simply there, like the water trough or the gallows that stood waiting on the far hill. Her throat was a desert. Her mind, once a frantic storm of prayer and denial, had quieted to a low, aching hum of endurance. She had forgotten the feeling of water, the taste of bread. She remembered only the hard face of Jedediah Thorne, the man who had put her here. His satisfaction had been a foul thing, a smell of sour wine and self-importance. He had declared her a thief for a stolen loaf of bread she had not stolen, and the town, his town, had accepted his word as gospel. He had wanted a spectacle, and she had become it. From the edge of the square, where the sun-blasted street met the long shadow of the livery stable, a man watched. He had been standing there for the better part of an hour, motionless as a heron waiting by a dry creek bed. His coat was the color of the dust that coated everything, a long duster that fell nearly to his worn boots. His hat was pulled low, but it could not hide the weariness that was carved into the lines around his mouth, or the quiet grief that lived deep in his eyes. He carried whole winters in those eyes. His name was Silas, though few in the town knew it. He kept to himself on his small homestead miles out, a place haunted by a silence that was older and deeper than his own. He came to town only when necessity demanded it, for salt and flour and news of the world he had largely left behind. He had seen cruelty before. He had seen greed and pride and the casual viciousness of men with too much power. But there was something in the girl's stillness that snagged on him. It was not the defiance of the proud, nor the cowering of the guilty. It was a resignation so complete it looked almost like peace. It was the quiet of a thing that had already broken. Jedediah Thorne eventually emerged from the saloon, his face flushed with drink and importance. He swaggered toward the center of the square, pausing to look upon his work. He gestured to the girl as if presenting a prize hog. "See what becomes of thieves in my town," he boomed, to no one and everyone. That was when Silas moved. He did not stride or march. He simply began to walk, his steps even and unhurried, kicking up small puffs of dust that lifted behind him like ghosts. He stopped a few feet from Thorne, his presence a sudden, quiet disruption. The air shifted. The few people still paying attention turned their heads. Thorne squinted at him, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Something I can help you with, farmer?" The word farmer was an insult. Silas did not look at Thorn. His gaze was on the girl, though not on her face. He looked at the frayed rope around her neck, at the raw red lines on her wrists where the other ropes bit into her skin. His own hands, calloused and cracked from work, remained loose at his sides. "I'll take her," Silas said. His voice was low and raspy, like it came from under floorboards. It was a voice unused to speaking. Thorn laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Take her. She's a thief. What would you want with her?" "I need a hand on the farm," Silas said, the words flat and practical. "The work is piling up." He finally met Thorn's gaze, and for a moment, the winter in his eyes seemed to frost the air between them. Thorn was amused now. The idea was novel. To send the girl from a public pillar to a private servitude on some dirt-poor homestead, it was a fitting, even more complete humiliation. "Fine," he sneered, a grin spreading across his face. "But she's yours to deal with. She steals from you, you can't come crying to me." Silas gave a single, sharp nod. He reached into a pocket of his duster and pulled out 3 dull coins, the sum of his intended purchases. He didn't offer them to Thorn. He tossed them onto the ground between them. They landed with a soft puff in the dust. A payment. Not for a person, but for a problem. Thorn stared at the coins, his sneer faltering. He had been dismissed. Before he could muster another retort, Silas had turned his back on him and walked to the post. The girl, the woman, did not look up. She heard the soft footfalls stop in front of her. She braced herself for a blow, a curse, another glob of spit. Instead, she saw a hand enter her small field of vision. It held a knife, its blade worn smooth with use. The hand was steady. It moved not to her, but to the ropes that bound her wrists. With 2 quick, efficient cuts, the ropes fell away. Her hands dropped to her sides, heavy and useless, pins and needles already starting their sharp dance beneath her skin. Then the knife moved upward, and with another clean slice, the sign fell from her neck and landed face down in the dust. The word thief was buried. He stepped back immediately, giving her space. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He just waited. She stood there for a long moment, untethered. The freedom was a shock, a sudden vertigo. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her head. She saw him for the first time, a tall, lean man whose face was a map of hardship. But his eyes, for all the winter they held, were not cruel. They were just, quiet. Without a word, he turned and began to walk toward the livery stable. He did not look back to see if she was following. He assumed she would. And she did. She took one hesitant step, then another, her bare feet clumsy on the hot ground. The townsfolk watched in silence, their judgment shifting from her to this strange, quiet man who had claimed her. She kept her eyes on his back, a dusty landmark in a hostile country. It was the only thing to follow. The journey was a long stretch of silence drawn taut between them. He retrieved his horse, a stoic gray mare that seemed a mirror of its owner, and led it by the reins. He did not offer her a ride, and she did not expect one. She walked behind him, her steps falling into a rhythm with the horse's slow, plodding gait. The town fell away behind them, its sounds replaced by the scuff of their feet on the dry road and the sighing of a wind that carried the scent of sage and sun-baked stone. The land itself was holding its breath. The sun beat down, and the heat shimmered up from the ground in glassy waves. Her thirst became a solid thing in her throat, a ball of fire. She stumbled once, her bare foot catching on a sharp rock. A small gasp escaped her lips. The man stopped. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed. He stood there for a moment, listening to the vast, empty silence. Then, without looking at her, he unhooked a canteen from his saddle. He held it out behind him, a blind offering. She hesitated. Kindness felt like a trap. But the thirst was a more immediate enemy. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she took the heavy tin canteen. Her fingers brushed against his, and his skin was dry and warm, like worn leather. She drank, the water tasting of metal and life. She drank until the fire in her throat was banked to embers, then she stoppered it and held it out. He took it and hooked it back onto the saddle, and then they were moving again. The exchange had taken less than a minute, and not a single word had passed between them. It was the first brick laid in the foundation of a house that did not yet exist. They arrived at his home as the sun was bleeding a deep, blood-orange stain across the western sky. The homestead was just as he was, weathered, solitary, and ringed with a profound quiet. A small cabin of graying timber sat in a shallow dip of the land, flanked by a listing barn and a chicken coop. A single, stubborn cottonwood tree provided the only shade. On a low rise overlooking the property, a simple wooden cross stood sentinel against the sky. The grave of the silence that haunted this place. The cabin was one room. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a sturdy table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and a narrow bed was tucked into one corner. Everything was scoured clean but worn down to its essential self. There was no softness here, no decoration. It was a place for survival, not living. He gestured to a small cot in the opposite corner from his own bed. It was little more than a frame with a thin mattress and a single, patched blanket. "That's yours," he said. The second thing he had said to her all day. He moved to the hearth, where a pot of something simmered over low embers. He ladled a thin stew into 2 bowls. He set one on the table for himself and placed the other on the floor beside her cot. He did not invite her to the table. He was not offering fellowship, only sustenance. He ate his own meal quickly, his eyes on the fire. She sat on the edge of the cot and ate. The stew was mostly potato and broth, but it was hot, and it filled a painful, gnawing emptiness inside her. She ate slowly, trying to make it last. When she was finished, she took the bowl to a wash basin by the door, cleaning it with the same quiet efficiency she had seen in him. That night, as she lay on the cot, she listened to the sounds of the house. The creak of the floorboards as he moved, the sigh of the embers in the hearth, the low moan of the wind as it pressed against the walls. She half expected to hear the sound of a bolt sliding home, the metallic click of a lock. But it never came. He banked the fire and went to his bed, and the door remained unlocked. It was a statement more powerful than any promise. "You are not a prisoner here." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she did not sleep on a stone floor in the dark. Days bled one into the next, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. A routine began to form, unspoken and unwritten. He would rise before dawn, and the sound of him stirring the fire would be her alarm. He would work outside, tending to his horse, mending the endless series of fences that sagged like tired old men. She began to work, too. At first, her movements were tentative. She swept the floor of the cabin, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a comfort. She learned the rhythms of the few chickens he kept, gathering their eggs each morning and scattering their feed. She found a patch of earth near the cabin where stubborn vegetables grew, potatoes, onions, hardy greens. She began to tend it, her fingers rediscovering the feel of soil, pulling weeds with a quiet diligence. They worked in parallel orbits, 2 solitary planets circling the same dim star of daily survival. He never told her what to do. He simply did his own work, and she found hers. He observed her from the corner of his eye as he split wood, noting the way she moved, the steady, determined set of her jaw. She was thin as a fence rail, but there was a current of strength in her that had not yet been broken. She observed him, too. She saw the way his hands, though rough, were gentle with the horse. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion that were etched around his eyes at the end of the day. One afternoon, while he was out on the far edge of his property, she walked up the low rise to the grave. She pulled the few weeds that had sprouted around the simple wooden cross. She did not know who was buried there, but she knew what loss felt like. It was a small gesture of solidarity with the silence. One evening, he came in from the fields and found one of his work shirts, torn at the shoulder, laid out on the table. A needle and a spool of coarse thread were beside it. He looked over at her. She was stirring the stew at the hearth, her back to him, but he saw the slight tensing of her shoulders. He picked up the shirt. Later that night, by the firelight, he watched her mend it. Her stitches were small and uneven, the work of someone unpracticed, but they were resolute. She was stitching their lives together with raw thread. The next morning, a heavy, worn wool shawl was folded neatly at the foot of her cot. The air had turned sharp with the promise of autumn, and the nights were growing cold. She ran her hand over the rough-spun wool. It was warm. She wore it all day. A week later, the handle of the well bucket she used every morning broke, the weathered wood finally giving way. She struggled to haul the water up without it. That afternoon, when she went back, a new handle had been carved and fitted, the fresh-cut pine smooth and fragrant under her hand. Their shared silence was no longer empty. It was filled with these small, quiet acts, a language of care that needed no words. The cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a space they shared. She started humming sometimes as she worked, a low, tuneless sound that was fragile as a moth's wing. The first time he heard it, he stopped what he was doing, his axe held mid-swing, and just listened. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a flood, but a crack in the dam. A nightmare seized her one night, a memory of cold stone and darkness and the sound of a key turning in a lock. She woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright on the cot, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. Across the room, Silas was sitting in his chair by the hearth, the embers casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He hadn't been sleeping. He was just sitting there, watching the fire die. He heard her cry, saw her panic, but he did not move toward her. He simply stayed where he was, a fixed point of stillness in her terror. His presence was an anchor. She drew her knees to her chest, her breathing ragged. The silence stretched, held only by the crackle of the last embers. "He locked me in the cellar," she said. The words came out thin and cracked, shards of glass. "For days. There were rats." Silas didn't respond for a long time. He just stared into the glowing heart of the fire. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "The door here," he said, "don't lock." It was not a comfort. It was a fact. It was a promise he had already made and was now renewing. She slowly uncurled, her breathing evening out. She lay back down, pulling the patched blanket and his wool shawl around her. She did not dream again that night. The next day, the air in the cabin felt different. Lighter. A seed of trust, planted in the hard soil of their shared desolation, had finally begun to sprout. She baked bread a few days later, using the last of his flour. The loaf was dense and heavy, and slightly burned on the bottom. She placed it on the table between them that evening, a silent offering. He broke off a piece and chewed it thoughtfully. He swallowed. "A little dry," he said, his expression unreadable. A flicker of something, disappointment, shame, crossed her face. She looked down at her hands. He broke off another piece. "You didn't complain about mine," he added, his voice still flat. It took her a moment to realize what it was. A jest. So subtle and dry it was almost lost in the quiet. A tiny smile, the first she had felt in an age, touched the corner of her lips. "That loaf died in vain," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. He grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh, and ate the rest of the piece. The bread was terrible. But they ate it all. The harbinger of the past arrived not as a rider, but as a flicker of unnatural light on the horizon. It was late, the sky a deep, star-pocked indigo. Silas saw it first from the cabin window. A faint, angry orange that pulsed against the dark line of the distant hills. It was in the direction of the southern pasture. A fire. He was pulling on his boots before he even spoke. "Stay inside." Bolt the door, it was the first time he had ever uttered the words. A command born of fear. He took his rifle from its pegs on the wall and was gone, swallowed by the night. She stood at the window, her knuckles white where she gripped the frame, and watched him disappear. For the first time, she did not feel fear for herself, but for him. The feeling was a terrifying, protective ache in her chest. The fire was not large, just a section of his fence line, deliberately set. He beat it out with a damp sack, the smoke acrid in his lungs. But it wasn't the fire that was the message. It was the hoof prints in the soft earth nearby. 3 horses. They hadn't even tried to hide their tracks. It was a calling card. A warning. Jedediah Thorne had not forgotten. He returned just before dawn, smelling of smoke and weariness. She had not slept. A pot of coffee was hot on the hearth, and the door was unbolted. He walked in and saw her sitting at the table, waiting. He looked at her, then at the unlocked door, and a silent understanding passed between them. She would not hide. Not anymore. They came 2 days later, just as the sun was at its zenith. 3 riders cresting the hill, their forms dark against the bright sky. Jedediah Thorne was in the lead, flanked by 2 hard-faced men who looked as if they had been born in the saddle. They rode down into the small valley of Silas's homestead as if they owned it. Silas was waiting on the porch. He held no rifle, but his hands were not empty. He was whittling a piece of wood, the knife moving in slow, deliberate strokes. He did not get up as they approached. The woman, Lena, though she did not have that name yet, stood in the doorway behind him, a shadow framed by the dark interior of the cabin. She held a heavy cast-iron skillet in one hand, its weight a solid, comforting presence. "Silas," Thorne called out, his voice slick with false cordiality. He pulled his horse to a stop a few yards from the porch. "I've come for my property." Silas continued to whittle. Shavings fell like pale snow onto the porch steps. "You're mistaken," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. "There's no property of yours here." "Don't play dumb with me," Thorne sneered, his cordiality vanishing. "The girl. The thief. I was lenient letting you take her, but her term of service is over. I have a use for her now." He eyed the woman in the doorway, his gaze hungry and proprietary. "She's not a thing to be passed around," Silas said, finally looking up. The winter in his eyes was a blizzard now. "She stays here." Thorne laughed. "She has no say in it. And neither do you. She belongs to the man who claimed her. That was me, in town. You were just borrowing her." His argument was based on the twisted logic of ownership, on a social contract she had never signed. It was then that she moved. She stepped out of the shadow of the doorway and into the stark sunlight, the heavy skillet held at her side. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She looked directly at Thorne, and for the first time, he was seeing not an object of scorn, but a person. "I am not a thief," she said. Her voice was thin, but it did not tremble. It cut through the air, clean and sharp. "And I am not yours." Thorne's face hardened with fury. He had expected a cowering wretch. He had not expected this. This defiance. This unity. "You insolent." He made to dismount, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. But Silas was on his feet in an instant, the piece of wood and the whittling knife dropped. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stood at the top of the porch steps, between Thorne and the woman, a silent, unbreachable wall. His stillness was more menacing than any threat. "You'll leave now," Silas said. It was not a request. One of Thorne's men shifted in his saddle, his hand hovering over his own gun. But he looked from Silas's unyielding face to the woman's steady gaze, and he hesitated. There was no fear here. There was something harder. Something they did not want to test. Thorne saw it too. He was a man of bluster, a bully who fed on fear. Faced with courage, he faltered. He looked around the small, poor homestead. This wasn't worth it. His pride was stung, but his cowardice was stronger. This isn't over, he spat, but the threat was hollow. He yanked on his horse's reins, turning it so sharply that it whinnied in protest. Without another word, he and his men rode away, their retreat kicking up a cloud of angry dust that soon settled back into the quiet earth. They stood there for a long time after the riders had disappeared over the rise, listening to the silence rush back in. The air was thick with the echoes of what had happened, with the words she had spoken, with the stand he had taken. The world felt new, reshaped. He turned and looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the strength that had been forged in the fire of her past, the resilience that had taken root in this quiet, lonely place. She looked back at him, and in his eyes, she saw not a savior, but a partner. An equal. He nodded once, a gesture of profound, unspoken affirmation. Then he bent down, picked up his piece of wood, and went back inside the cabin. She followed, placing the heavy skillet back on its hook by the hearth. He put another log on the fire, and the flames leaped up, chasing the shadows from the corners of the room. They had faced the past together and won. The house was theirs now. Truly theirs. A few days passed in a new kind of quiet. It was not the silence of strangers, but the comfortable silence of those who have no need for words. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sky soften to the color of a bruised plum. The air was cool and smelled of pine and coming snow. "What was your name?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked out at the land, at the hills that had become her horizon. The name she had been born with felt like a dress that no longer fit, a relic of a person who no longer existed. That person was a victim, a girl tied to a post. She was not that girl anymore. "I don't have one," she said softly. Silas was quiet for a long time, turning the question over in his mind. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the line of her jaw, at the steadiness in her gaze. He thought of new beginnings, of things scrubbed clean and given a second chance. "Lena," he said. It was not a question. It was a gift. A naming. She tried the word out in the quiet of her own mind. Lena. It felt right. It felt like her. She looked at him and gave a small, slow nod. A tear she didn't know she was holding slid down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. The girl without a name was gone. Lena was here. The next day, she took the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one that carried the dust and shame of the town square, and she built a small fire behind the cabin. She watched the flames consume the worn fabric, turning the memory of her humiliation into smoke and ash that drifted away on the wind. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. She went back inside, wearing a simple dress stitched from two of Silas's old flour sacks, and felt clean. Reborn. That winter, Silas began to change the house. He built a small set of shelves and mounted them on the wall beside her cot. She filled them with things she found, a strangely shaped stone, a bird's feather, a jar of dried herbs. It was the first touch of softness the cabin had ever known. He repaired the leaky roof of the barn, not with patches, but with new timber. He was no longer just maintaining a place of grief, he was building a home. Winter settled over the land, blanketing it in a deep, cleansing snow. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, to the circle of warmth cast by the fire. The silence between them was now a language of its own, rich with meaning and shared history. It was in the way he passed her the coffee in the morning, the way she placed a bowl of hot stew before him at night. It was in the shared glance across the hearth, a quiet acknowledgement of all they had survived, and all they had become. One night, with a blizzard howling outside, he was mending a piece of tack, his head bent in concentration. He was wearing the shirt she had repaired for him months ago, the one with the clumsy, uneven stitches. She was sitting on her cot, wrapped in the wool shawl he had given her, reading a worn book he'd had tucked away. The fire crackled. The wind screamed. But inside the cabin, there was a profound peace. She looked at him, at this quiet, broken man who had offered her a foothold in the world, who had stood with her, who had given her a name. He had not rescued her. He had made a space for her to rescue herself. And in doing so, he had found his own way back from the edge of his own grief. The house, which had once felt haunted by loss, now felt full. It breathed with them. He looked up, as if feeling her gaze, and their eyes met across the warm, fire-lit room. No words were needed. Everything that mattered was there in the space between them, a silent promise of a shared future, a quiet testament to the resilience of the human heart. They had stitched their lives together, not with vows, but with simple acts of decency, with shared bread and a shared silence. They were a family, forged in the crucible of a harsh land, a home built not of timber and stone, but of the quiet, unyielding strength of two souls who had found each other in the wreckage. This story, it isn't just about rescue. It's about the profound courage it takes to truly see another person. To look past the labels the world has hung on them, thief, outcast, broken, and see the human being underneath, waiting for a chance to be reborn. It's about understanding that the greatest act of love isn't always a grand declaration, but sometimes, it's a quiet, steady presence. An unlocked door. A shared meal in a warm room while the wind howls outside. So here is your naming. Think of the parts of yourself you feel have been discarded, mislabeled, or tied to a post for the world to judge. We all have them. We are all, in some way, waiting in our own dusty town squares. The story tells us that a new beginning isn't something you find. It's something you build, one quiet act of kindness at a time. It's the bravery to offer someone a new name, a safe harbor. And it is the grace to accept that gift for yourself. If you are brave enough to offer that quiet space, or brave enough to step into it, you might find that you are not just saving another. You are also saving yourself. Because a person isn't a thing to be claimed. They are a life to be met. And sometimes, the most profound love isn't spoken in vows, but in a shared silence by a winter fire, in a house that